My guest today is two-time Grammy Award winner and four-time Grammy nominee Ernie Watts. He has been playing the saxophone for more than 50 years, and from the age 16 onwards, he has been playing professionally. Initially, while still attending school, he won a downbeat scholarship to the Berklee College of Music in Boston. While studying at Berklee, Watts was recommended by trombonist Phil Wilson, a Berklee professor, to replace Gene Quill in Buddy Rich's big band, and left Berklee to stay with Buddy Rich from 1966 to 1968. And he toured the world, also recording two albums with the band, Big Swing Face and The New One. Next, Watts moved to LA and began working in the big bands of Gerald Wilson and Oliver Nelson. With the Nelson Band, Watts visited Africa on a U.S. State Department tour in 1969. In addition, Watts had the occasion to record with the legendary Thelonious Monk on the album Monk's Blues, a Columbia album. During the 70s and 80s, Watts immersed in the busy production scene of LA. His signature sound was heard on countless TV shows and movie scores, almost all the early West Coast Motown sessions, and with pop stars such as Aretha Franklin and Steely Dan. Watts has been featured on over 500 recordings by artists ranging from Cannonball Adderley to Frank Zappa. In 1982, Watts won the Grammy for Best Pop Instrumental Performance for Chariots of Fire theme dance version. In 1983, Watts performed with Charlie Hayden's Liberation Music Orchestra and also toured with Pat Metheny's Special Quartet. In 1985, Watts won the Grammy for Best R&B Instrumental Performance, Orchestra, Group, or Soloist for Musician. Watts' charter membership in Hayden's critically acclaimed Quartet West continued for almost 30 years until Hayden's death. He has recorded 15 albums as a leader for a variety of labels large and small, and in 2004, Watts started Flying Dolphin Records, releasing a series of critically acclaimed albums such as Alive, Spirit Song, Analog Man, To The Point, 4+4, Oasis, and 2016's Wheel of Time. Ernie Watts, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
What a thrill to have the great Ernie Watts on the show. I think maybe we should begin with, you mentioned in an interview that really you started in the modal scene of jazz, so to speak, with Coltrane and Miles. Could you talk a little bit of how you really got started playing the saxophone when you were young in Delaware?
Yeah, I was in school, and it was the beginning of the school year. I was in grade 7, and I think I was like 13 at the time. And the school had instruments to lend for young people to learn how to play. So I was with a friend of mine, and he wanted to go and get a saxophone. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wasn't particularly drawn to learning how to play a musical instrument. So I just sort of went with him, you know. And we got to the music department of the school, and my friend got a tenor saxophone. He wanted a saxophone. He got a tenor saxophone. And I figured I'd try the trombone. You know, I must have seen the Glenn Miller story or something like that on TV the week before, and it seemed like the trombone would be a nice idea. So I asked the teacher, and it happened that the music department was all out of trombones, and the teacher had told me that they had a baritone saxophone, so I started on the baritone saxophone because I was tall for my age, and the teacher figured I would be able to carry it in marching band. So, you know, there's a big marching band tradition here in the U.S., so that's how I started on the saxophone. So my very first instrument was a baritone sax.
Now, did you have a private teacher, or did you all learn at the school?
I started in the school, and I got interested personally, and so I started practicing every day myself. You know, my parents didn't have to force me to practice. It was always something that I chose to do myself. And as it happened, after I had been playing the baritone for a short amount of time, the school got an alto saxophone. And I tell people when I tell this story, I tell them the school got an alto saxophone, and the teacher let me start playing the alto because I was carrying the baritone back and forth from school to my home every day, and the teacher noticed that my right arm was 4 inches longer than my left arm. So therefore, he let me have the alto. So that's how I started on the alto saxophone. So that's my little joke I tell when I do workshops for the kids and stuff. So I started playing alto saxophone, and our school did not have a jazz program, so I started learning classical saxophone repertoire for the saxophone and studying classical music, and at that time I started to study privately. So I had a private teacher for saxophone. I had a private teacher for classical, and I studied all the literature for saxophone, for classical saxophone.
What kind of, if I could pry, what particular pieces or etude books were you using at the time?
Well, there's a great saxophone book that I started out on, which was called A Universal Method for Saxophone. It was written by a man named Paul DeVille. That was my first big book, my first big classical book. But I studied out of the Rubank books, and then as I kept practicing and kept studying, I started to play a lot of the French music for saxophone. There was a great classical saxophone player named Marcel Mule, and there was a lot of music written for him, and I started playing a lot of the sonatas and a lot of the piano and saxophone pieces that were written for the French saxophonists. And my saxophone teacher was an excellent piano player, so I began to do saxophone competitions, and I won several saxophone competitions playing these classical pieces with my piano, with my saxophone teacher who played piano. And so I won several competitions, and then from that I was asked to perform a very famous saxophone piece by a composer named Jacques Ibert, and it's called the Concertina da Camera for saxophone and orchestra. And so when I was about 16 or 17 or so, I performed that piece with the Delaware Symphony Orchestra, which was made up of members of the Philadelphia Orchestra and members of people in Wilmington, Delaware, there where I grew up. So I played that piece when I was about 16, and at the same time that I was studying classical saxophone, I started to learn to play jazz by ear. So I was playing and practicing jazz from listening to records and also playing classical music. So my background as a player has always been a balanced thing between the technical aspect of playing the instrument correctly, playing the classical music, playing in tune, learning all the scales, that aspect of playing the saxophone joined with the intuitive aspect of playing, with improvisation, with playing by ear, training my ear, and learning to play things from hearing also. So my playing has always been a combination between the classical aspect and then the intuitive aspect of playing.
Do you have perfect pitch, or do you have very strong relative pitch?
Yeah, I don't have perfect pitch. I have, I guess you would call it relative pitch, just from playing for years and years and years. I can generally hear notes and know what the notes are, and I can generally hear the chords and know what the chords are that way, just from practice, just from time, just from study.
Now, when it comes to all the scales you mentioned, if we could go just a little bit technical, you're referring to almost every scale, right? The major, all the minors, and the. So, is it fair to say at that age of 16, you had all your scales down?
That way, yeah, classically. And then what I learned after a while, see, I was learning how to play jazz by ear, and when I graduated from high school, I went to teacher's college for a year because when I told my mother I wanted to be a musician, she got very, very concerned about my starving to death as a musician. So she wanted me to go to college and get a teacher's degree so I would have something to fall back on if if I didn't make it as a professional musician. So I went to the Westchester State Teachers College in Pennsylvania for a year for my mom, and that didn't really work out for me. So what happened was I dropped out of school. I told my mom that really didn't work for me, and she understood that. I dropped out of school, and I taught privately in Wilmington, Delaware for a while. I taught beginners. I taught kids in schools, And then during that period, that short period of time, I auditioned for a scholarship, the saxophone scholarship to the Berklee School of Music in Boston. I won the Berklee School scholarship. So when I went to Berklee, what I learned was, I had been playing jazz by ear. I had been studying the classical saxophone repertoire, so I was playing my instrument well. I knew the scales. I knew the scales in a classical manner. And when I went to Berklee, I learned that there was a scale for every chord. I learned that every chord has a scale that works for it. And so I learned that if you learn all the scales for all the chords, then it's impossible to make a mistake. It's impossible to play a wrong note if you know all the scales for all the chords. So I systematically learned all of that system, by practicing and playing with records. And I had been playing gigs with people when I was in high school, playing in dance bands and getting together with my friends and playing jam sessions. So I was playing things, and I was playing from records that I heard. I really loved John Coltrane, so I was listening to Coltrane all the time. And so a lot of the things that I was doing by ear, when I went to Berklee, I found out what the names of them were. I was already playing the lines. I was already playing from hearing other people solo, jazz, fashion music. I was playing jazz. I was playing like John Coltrane, but I just didn't know what it was. I was listening to Coltrane. I was listening to Charlie Parker. I was listening to Eric Dolphy and Ornette Coleman and all of those people and playing with those records. So I was playing that music, but I didn't know what the names of the scales were and stuff that worked. So that's what helped me so much when I went to Berklee. It was like I learned the scale for the chord, and then whenever I played a dominant chord or solo a dominant chord, I knew it was a Mixolydian scale. And then I said, oh, that's the sound. That's the scale. And so then I just systematically learned all the scales for all the chords that way and integrated that information into my playing.
Wilmington, you mentioned in an interview some real heavyweight musicians came out of Delaware. Could you mention a couple of those?
Well, Clifford Brown, who was a great trumpet player, great vibe player, Lynn Winchester. And then the other thing about Wilmington is it was like when I was a kid, driving from Wilmington to Philadelphia took about an hour and a half. Now it's like half an hour on the train. But in Philadelphia, there was a gigantic jazz scene. It was incredible. I mean, John Coltrane lived in Philadelphia. Benny Golson lived there. Lots of great, great musicians lived and came out of Philadelphia. And so that energy, that music energy was close to me. I didn't get to play with Clifford Brown. I didn't meet John Coltrane and Benny Golson at that time because I was a kid. I was like the next generation. So I couldn't get in the clubs and that kind of stuff. But all of those people were in that area. When I was in high school, I went to hear Cannonball Adderley play. He was from New York, and he had his group with Yusef Lateef. They came to the University of Delaware to do a concert, and then I met Cannon, and we talked, and we got along, and he let me play his instrument after the concert.
You were a young man. What did you ask Cannonball Adderley?
Oh, I just asked him about what reeds he used. I asked him about his mouthpiece. He let me play his horn after the concert. I asked him if I could try his horn so I could see how it felt, and he said, sure, that would be fine, but he wanted to do his concert first, and then after that I could come back and try his instrument. And we talked some more, and he was a very, very helpful, very kind man. And then later on, when I was working in L.A., he came to L.A. He moved to L.A., and I did several recordings with Cannonball, and we did some concerts around L.A. also.
Let's go chronologically. So at Berklee, your professor recommended you onto the to replace Gene Quill in Buddy Rich's band. Now, I have a friend who's a Buddy Rich fanatic. He loves Buddy Rich, so I got to ask for his sake, what was Buddy Rich like personally working with Buddy?
Well, he was very, very helpful. He was very, very focused on his music. He was the greatest, I think he was the greatest drummer, technically, that there ever has been. I mean, he did things on the drums that were just so smooth and so clear and so fast. I've never really heard anybody else.
Well, you said helpful. What did you mean by him being helpful to you as a young man?
Well, he was always very supportive of the music. He was always very supportive of my practicing and studying and playing, and he was helpful about that. We talked about all the people that he played with. He played with Charlie Parker. He played with Ben Webster. He played with all the great players, so we talked about that.
Any interesting anecdotes that he shared with you?
I can't remember of anything exactly except the fact that everybody used to talk about how abrasive he was, about how angry he was, and there's all these stories about Buddy Rich getting in arguments and all of that with people. But the thing that I learned from Buddy was the fact that he was interested in the music. He was interested in having his music played correctly, and if you were serious about your music, and if you were serious about working for him and playing his music, he was fine. There was no problem. The only problems that he had with people was when they didn't take care of their business. He would say there's 24 hours out of the day, and all he needed from us was to be responsible, look decent on stage, and play the music for 4 hours a day. He said out of 24 hours a day, all he needed from us was for us to take care of business and be responsible for 4 hours out of a 24-hour day. And some people had trouble getting that together. And the people that had trouble getting to the bandstand and making it work for that 4 hours a day, he had a problem with that. And then he would get angry. And that was totally understandable.
What I like about you, Ernie, is you're such a pro. You're such a professional. Like, you can kind of slot into any situation, and you're just so good at just doing your work like a real professional. I mean, you bring a real integrity to a gig. So Buddy must have loved you.
Yeah, we got along very well. So it was a good experience. It was a good relationship.
How does he practice? Does he? I know from watching your videos, you're a big advocate of practicing a number of hours a day. Was he similar in that regard?
Well, he was a special kind of person.
He said he didn't practice. Is that true?
He didn't practice much. He probably, he did his practicing when we got to the concert for sound checks and stuff like that. But you have to remember that he had been playing his whole life. See, he was playing from the time he was a year and a half old. He grew up in vaudeville. His family was on the road. They had an act. So they traveled all around the country, and they did these theater concerts and stuff. And when Buddy was a little baby, he would go with his family, and he'd sit by the band. He'd sit by the orchestra pit, and while his mom and dad were doing their thing. I think they were song and dance people. I think they had an act. He would sit by the bandstand, and when he was a little baby, he started tapping out things with the band and tapping out things with the drummer. And he was making all the breaks, and they recognized that in him. And so when he was like a year and a half, 2 years old, he started to become a little drummer. He was called Traps the Baby Wonder. He was a drum wonder when he was a little kid. So he played all his whole life. So he grew up in music that way. He was a gifted person. He didn't read music. He learned music from listening and then playing it. When we would learn new music with Buddy's band, we would sit on the stage in the club or the hall, wherever we were, and we played the arrangement 2 or 3 times, and Buddy would listen to it. We play it without the drums, and he would listen to what we played. And then he would get up on the bandstand, and he would play the drum parts. He would create drum parts. He would create his thing. So he was very gifted that way, and he played his whole life. So I guess he was really practicing his whole life,
Let's move forward to when you moved to LA and you worked with Oliver Nelson. Could you talk a little bit about that and the big band that he ran? How is that different coming from Buddy's big band?
Well, it wasn't a lot different. Oliver was a more mellow person, and he was very, very, very educated. I mean, he really knew his music. He knew about music. And I knew Oliver's music from the things that he did with Eric Dolphy, Blues and the Abstract Truth, and those things that he did for 7-piece band. I knew Oliver from his big band arrangements that were incredible. He did an album called Afro-American Sketches that was just one of the great albums that I remember as a young man. So when I met him, I was familiar with his music, and I started playing in his band. He wanted me to play with his group, so I played with his big band, and I also did a State Department tour of Africa with Oliver, with a small group, with a 7-piece band like the size of that band that did Blues and the Abstract Truth, and I did TV. He came to L.A. to work on TV shows and films and stuff, and so I played on his TV shows. He did a show called The $6 Million Man, and I played on those shows and lots of concerts. So he was a great musician.
Around that time, you got the opportunity to record with Thelonious Monk. And could you talk about that event on Monk's Blues? What was that session like?
Well, that was a project with Oliver. That was a project of Oliver's. It was Monk's band and a big band that Oliver did all the arrangements for. And so I played lead alto on that project, and that was Oliver's arrangements of Monk's tunes. And I got a chance to meet Thelonious Monk, and we talked a bit.
What did you guys talk about? Because I've heard he's not the easiest person to talk to.
Well, he was very quiet, and it was right before he got ill. He was getting older then. I just told him that I really appreciated his music and I really enjoyed what he did, and and I listened to him play, and he listened to me play a little bit, and we just had a nice rapport. It just felt good being around him, and I enjoyed his company, and I think he enjoyed my company, so it was pleasant.
Anything that stood out from your conversation with him?
Well, basically, we were just getting the music together to perform. I mean, all of that music was new to us, and we were getting the music together to record. When you work in the studios, you play the music, you rehearse the music down one time, and then you start recording. So the main thing we were talking about was technical aspects of the music and making sure all the notes were right and making sure that all of the rhythms and things were right for the arrangement. So it was technical stuff about that music. And his saxophone player that he played with for years, he was there, Charles Rouse, who was a great saxophone player. And it was a very nice interaction. And Oliver wrote some great charts, and it turned out really well. Another thing I did with Oliver was we did an album with Louis Bellson's band and James Brown, and it was a James Brown album called Soul on Top. James Brown, and it was Louis Bellson's band, and Oliver Nelson wrote all the arrangements, and that was quite an adventure too. That was a lot of fun.
I'm sure you must have been answering all these questions about all the different people you've recorded with, but if you could indulge me just a little bit, I'm curious. So, did you get to hang out with James Brown and talk to him as well?
A little bit, yeah. He knew who I was, from records and things like that. I played on a bunch of his records, because what they would do a lot of the groups that toured, like Earth, Wind and Fire and James Brown and Marvin Gaye and the Temptations and all of those people, they recorded with the studio musicians. They recorded with the people in LA that were doing all of the records because we read all the music correctly. We played in tune. Everything was right the first time. So a lot of the big groups that did these big recordings, they used us to do the recordings. And then when they went on the road, they had a road band that they used that traveled with them, So I did a lot of recording with a lot of pop groups and R&B groups. And James Brown, I did several recordings with James Brown, because it was the studio people that got the parts right, and then when they went out on the road, they used their road band.
It says you worked with Aretha Franklin as well, and she's a tremendous talent. Describe working with her.
Right. Well, that was a recording, and it was all done. A lot of the things that I did with people were things where the rhythm tracks were already done, and then we went in and we put the horn sections on. And then I sometimes would do a solo, and I would do a solo over the pre-recorded track. And the stuff I did with Aretha was like that. It was horn section things over the rhythm section parts that were already done. A lot of pop music is like that. And she was very kind, and she was very gracious and nice lady. I did that with quite a few artists.
Did you work with the Jackson 5 as well?
Not when they were kids, not when they were little kids. When they got older, I did a bunch of stuff with them, and I did a bunch of stuff with Michael, when he became a solo artist.
And what was it like working with Michael?
Well, they were all good people,
I get the sense that they're all very serious when it comes to what's going on in the studio and getting the things right.
Yeah, because that's where the music really is, The performance, what they do, and their show and everything, that's their show. That's their showbiz thing. That's their act. But when they're in the studio working on their music and working on writing and working on their parts, they're just good people trying to get their music done correctly and working to get things done technically so that it sounds really good. And then once the record is out, then you see what you see. You know, then the public sees what they see. They see the show, they see the act and all of that. But before all of that, the act and the show and everything is built on how that music sounds. And so from the beginning, it's about the music. And all of those people were very serious about their music. Marvin Gaye was very serious about his music. The Rolling Stones are very serious about their music.
Can you describe working with Marvin Gaye on Let's Get It On? And that was a very, very famous album in the history of music. What was it like working on that album and working with Marvin Gaye?
Well, he had his own studio, and it was a private studio. He worked when he felt like it, and sometimes we worked late at night. Frank Zappa liked to work late at night, too. We used to have sessions that didn't start until 11 o'clock at night. A lot of people are night people, you know. So Marvin worked at night a lot, and he worked out his rhythm sections and stuff. And it was like I was telling you before, you know, when I got there, they had worked on the rhythm parts, and the rhythm tracks were done. Then we got together, and we talked about where the spaces were, where he wanted me to play, or where he wanted to do a horn part, a section part, and stuff like that. And then we would put stuff together over the track. You know, and sometimes I would play a solo. Sometimes we would take a part and we would double it or do it in harmony and make section parts, you know, with other people. I used to work a lot with a trumpet player named Oscar Brashear and a trombone player named George Bohannon, and we did a lot of stuff for Motown and different R&B projects that were put together in that way. You know, a lot of times the artist wasn't sure about composition and about what chords were right and voicings and that kind of stuff, but they had a part. You know, they knew where they wanted the horns to do a particular line. They knew what they wanted a particular sound to be, but they didn't know technically how to put it together, and so we would help with that. You know, we'd put the chords together. We'd say, would you like this kind of a sound, or would you like this kind of a sound? And then they picked what they like, and then we would put the sound on. We would put the part on.
Yeah, in many ways, Ernie, you and your crew were really responsible for that iconic sound. Were you creating it from earlier influences, or is it something that you guys made special for that decade? Did you feel the music changing in the pop sense, that you were accommodating these changes? How did that iconic sound come about, the vocabulary for those recordings, so to speak?
Well, basically, it was related to other things that were happening at the same time. You know, there was a sound. There were people that were writing. There was a great writer that wrote for a lot of pop records, named Gene Page. He wrote a lot of stuff for string orchestras and big projects. Like he did all of Barry White stuff, right? Barry White didn't read music, but what Barry White would do was he'd sit at home and play his parts on his piano at home into a cassette machine. He would give what he played on the cassette to Gene Page. Gene Page would take what Barry gave him and he would orchestrate it for like 20 violins, you know, cellos, violas, and it would be a whole orchestra. You know, that Love Unlimited stuff that we used to do and all of those things, that was Gene Page. Yeah, Barry wrote the grooves, Barry wrote the melodies, and he had the concept. It was Barry's concept. But Gene Page orchestrated all of that music. And that's what a lot of people did. Jerry Hay, I worked for years with Jerry Hay. We worked with Earth, Wind, and Fire. And Jerry Hay would get the information, and he would write the horn arrangements. So Jerry wrote a lot of horn arrangements.
That's really interesting, where all of those iconic sounds and those hits comes from. All these really talented people are behind the scenes. That names that most people don't typically know are really responsible for that sound.
Yeah, because they had the technical knowledge. The artist had the feeling. The artist had the dream, and the people that helped were the musicians that knew about the harmony and what chords were and how to make it sound together. So it was always like interaction that way. There was a guy named James Carmichael that I did a whole bunch of stuff with at Motown, who did all of the Commodore stuff, and I played on all that stuff. But he would write the arrangements. James would listen to what the track was or listen to what the music was, and then he would fill in the gaps, the knowledge. Where should the flute part be? Where should the saxophone solo be, or where should the trumpets be? There's a lot of people behind the scenes in the music business.
I want to ask you, you mentioned Frank Zappa. It just shows the breadth of the amount of people that you've worked with. You've really worked with almost everyone, and it's really impressive. A friend of mine, a musician colleague, Simon Hughes, he wanted to ask a question. You mentioned Frank worked late. How was he like? Was he a taskmaster? Was he a very strict guy? His music is very precise. Did he demand very precise rehearsals and that kind of thing?
He got really good musicians. His music was difficult. I thought of Frank Zappa as being a classical composer. I thought of him as being a contemporary classical composer that used a rock rhythm section. He had the techniques of Alban Berg or any of these other people that he knew about contemporary classical orchestral literature. And so he embraced the rock thing and the classical thing together. And that's how his music came together. So note-wise, there was a lot of notes. It was difficult to play, but what he did was he knew the musicians. He knew who could play his music. And so he got people together that could play his music. And so the rehearsals were not really difficult. The rehearsals were not hard because we practiced our parts. So that when we got there and it was time to play, we could play that music. And it was a lot of fun. He was a very bright man.
So he must have loved you guys. You guys are all pros.
Well, and he was a very good musician, and he knew about classical and he knew about jazz, and so he was a lot of fun to work with, and he was very bright. So we had a good time.
Now I want to go on to your work on the Tonight Show, which is that's like the biggest TV show. In that period, like everybody knew the Tonight Show, and you worked for 20 years working with the great Doc Severinsen.
It was like going to school for me, because in the trumpet section there was Conte Candoli, who was one of the great jazz trumpet players. There was Snooky Young, who was one of the great jazz trumpet players and lead players. There were all of these people in the band that were masters of what they did. There was Ed Shaughnessy, who was one of the great drummers. Ross Tompkins, who was a piano player that could play anything in any key. He was just amazing. I sat next to a tenor player named Pete Chrislieb that was just one of the great saxophone players. I learned so much about playing from playing with every day with him. You learn to play every day from listening and sitting next to people who play great. And then there was all the people that came on the show, like Dizzy Gillespie would come on the Tonight Show. You talk with him, you'd listen to him play. There was there were all of these great people.
Did you get a chance to talk to Dizzy and ask him about music?
Well, sure. You talk to everybody. They're all there, and they're all just people. And Dizzy used to love to talk about music, so everybody would hang out with Dizzy. He was just a very, very, very social.
What did you guys talk about when it came to music?
Well, really, he talked more about time and rhythm. He was very, very involved in Cuban music, and so we talked about clave. We talked about how you use different instruments within the Cuban rhythm section situation, that kind of thing. He was very involved in the rhythmic aspect of music, and of course harmony, because he and Charlie Parker, they revolutionized jazz harmony in the 40s. 1948, 1949, he and Charlie Parker, they created that thing called bebop. They were the guys. So he knew a lot, and he was a very, very, very jovial, very sociable, pleasant person. He was a lot of fun.
Talk about your Grammy Award-winning performance on the Chariots of Fire theme, 1982, the dance version. What do you remember of that recording and winning the Grammy for that piece?
That was a project that was put together by Quincy Jones, and the exact recording session for that I did in 2 days. I was working with the Rolling Stones. I was on the road with the Rolling Stones at the time. We were on tour, their Tattoo You tour, which was like 1981. And we had 2 days off in San Francisco. And I flew down to L.A., and I did the recording. I did the project for Chariots of Fire in L.A., and then I went back up to San Francisco and continued my tour with the Rolling Stones till that was done, and then we finished up the Chariots of Fire project after that, and it was a big surprise, to win my first Grammy from that,
The actual recording itself, were you expecting anything special? Like, was that just another one of your many, many gigs?
I played so much, and I played on so many pop things that it wasn't unusual for a pop date or an R&B date in that way. The only thing that was different about it was in my name.
Yeah.
You have to understand me, Nikhil. I've been studying and practicing since I was 13 years old. The music that I grew up listening to was John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Eric Dolphy, Joe Henderson, and all of these incredible musicians. So basically, I was really very overtrained for pop music. The music that I listened to when I was a kid growing up, when I listened to John Coltrane, when I listened to Eric Dolphy and all of these people when I was a kid, when I was 13 or 14 years old, I just thought that everybody played that way. I thought that was the way you played the saxophone. So that's how I learned how to play the saxophone. So I was 21 or 22 years old before I realized that the people that I spent all of that time listening to for hundreds of hours were some of the best saxophone players that ever lived, period, right? So all of the technique and all of the information that I learned from their playing and from studying that music and from going to Berklee and studying all those scales and everything, it made it extremely easy for me to do R&B and pop-oriented music, because the music was a simpler, a more innocent form of music than what I had learned. So for me, I had to unlearn. You know what I mean? I had to unlearn in order to do pop music and a lot of the blues stuff and a lot of the R&B stuff, because I had too much knowledge. When you grew up listening to John Coltrane, it's very hard to play the blues, the simple blues. So I had to simplify my concepts. So what happened with me in playing pop music and playing rock music and playing commercial music was I had to simplify my playing a lot. And what I did during that time was I focused on my sound, because when you play on a pop record, when you play on a rock record, there's nothing you can do really harmonically. Most of that music is blues-oriented music, or it's simple music chord structurally. So there's not a lot you can do. As you know, what I'm saying is you don't play a Charlie Parker solo on a Marvin Gaye tune. You don't play a John Coltrane solo on a Barry White tune. You simplify what you do harmonically as far as the notes you choose and the chords you play, but that puts more emphasis on your sound. When all you can play is 3 or 4 notes, when you only have a choice of 3 or 4 notes, then it's very, very important about the sound that you get, your tone quality that you get on your instrument. And so people hear me play and they say, well, I can always tell it's you because I can tell your sound. And that's because I spent a lot of time working on my tone too.
I wanted to get to what happened was really exciting in 2004. You started your own label. Now, I want to, if I could, go over the tracks in each song, and if you could just give me a brief description of. I want to try and see if I can get through as many as I can. We'll start with Alive in 2004. Could you talk? Let's just go track by track and just give me what comes to mind really briefly on each track. So let's go with 3 + 5 = 4. Could you talk about that track?
Yeah, that's a rhythm pattern. And so 3 and 5 are a rhythm pattern in that tune. And so we wrote the melody. I wrote the melody around that rhythmic pattern. So that was that's why that is sounds like that.
How about River of Light?
That's in 3/4. It's a waltz, and it's reminiscent of a song that I like to play called All Blues, and it has that feeling. It was a Miles tune. River of Light. It alludes to a vision that I had of the 405 freeway. It comes down the hill going from the city side into the valley side of Los Angeles, and at night there's this hill that's just solid lights, because it's a traffic jam. So it's a river of light. One side of the road is white light, one side of the road is red light, but it's a river It's just this continuous river of light. So that's where that came from.
Now talk about The Plan.
That's like a jazz sort of a march that I wrote. That has a lovely melody to it that I came up with. Yeah. Great.
And how about Angel's Flight?
That's a very, very energetic tune, and it's about energy. It's about velocity of energy. And people think of angels, people think of little angels in white robes with wings that float around like butterflies. And there's a lot of different kinds of angels. So this angel is an energetic, powerful angel.
What's your approach to composition?
Melody. I usually come from the melody because I play a melodic instrument. I play a voice instrument, the saxophone. I play a line instrument. So most of the time I'll come from some form of a line, a melodic pattern, and then I'll fill out the harmony from there. I'll do the basic harmony. I'll write the bass line. I'll get the basic concept, and then I will get together with somebody I know, a friend of mine that plays great piano, and I'll talk about the chords, and I'll talk about what composition, what substitutes, or how to deal with the choices. A lot of times when you play a chord in a song, it can be 2 or 3 other chords. Like when Jeremy and I work together, we'll work together on a tune. I'll have a melody. He's playing the piano, and he'll say, well, what do you think of this? Or what do you think of this? And he plays these different sounds, and then we decide what sound works best. So a lot of the tunes I write in conjunction with really good piano players that I work with. I'll work with Jeremy. Or you see some of these tunes, say, David Witham. I work with David Witham. I've worked with a lot of different players. Mark Seals from Seattle. He writes some beautiful things, and we work together to get the right sound, harmonically. Because I'm not a great piano player, It's like.
But you do play the piano a little bit.
I play some. I play enough to do basic composition, but to sit down and go bang, one chord, bang, 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 like that, that's difficult for me because I can't do it fast enough to hear the difference, right? So I sit with someone that plays really good piano, and they go, well, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And we talk about it in that way, and it helps me make choices that way because it's clearer, it's cleaner.
When you write, do you write any time of day? I mean, it's kind of off the wall, but like, is it mornings good, night times good? When do you work?
When I'm practicing. I usually write while I'm practicing. So I'll be working on something harmonically for my horn. I'll be practicing my instrument, and then I'll hear a line, and then I'll play that. Or my friend Mark Seals, sometimes he'll give me a cassette that'll just be harmony. It'll just be chords. It'll be chord patterns or sets of things. He'll say, hey, Ernie, I'm working on this thing here, and I've got this set of chords, and what do you think? And then I'll listen to what he's done, and I'll put a melody with that or make some changes to that. So I'm always working on things from sound, things from melody.
And how many hours do you practice a day?
2 or 3. Unless I'm traveling, unless I'm on a plane, I try to practice at least 2 hours a day.
Could you talk about the album Spirit Song, 2005? Talk about the Boobala dance.
Yeah, Boobala is like it's a word that my wife and I made up. It means you're sweetie. My wife is my Boobala. She's my Boobala. I'm her Boobala. That's what it means. It means my sweetie. I wrote that with Jeremy, and that was a thing that we did where I had written a line, and I wrote this fast line, and we were doing a tour. I usually write with Jeremy when we're on a tour. We usually try to write a couple of tunes together. Every time we get together, we try to write a couple of tunes together. And this one I wrote with Jeremy, and it's from a fast line that I wrote, and then we worked out the harmonies to it.
And how about the Spirit song, the title track?
Spirit song I wrote for the flute. You know, when I got married, Patricia and I, we went on our honeymoon, and we take the trains when we travel in the U.S. When I do gigs, when I do domestic gigs around the country in the U.S., we go on the trains. And so when Patricia and I got married, we took our honeymoon on a train. We went across the country on a train. And so we went as part of our honeymoon trip. We went to New Mexico, right? And so when we went to New Mexico, we went to Albuquerque, and then we went up to now I'm spacing it. Patricia, where did we go in New Mexico? Oh, we went to Santa Fe. We went up to Santa Fe, New Mexico for a few days. And they had these Native American flutes that they had there. And Patricia bought me, Navajo flutes, and she bought me this flute in the key of A minor. And so I wrote a tune for this flute. And that's what Spirit Song is about. And you hear this little Native American flute in the beginning and the end of this piece, and that's the flute that Patricia bought for me when we were on our honeymoon.
Now let's move on to Analog Man. What was your goal with that album?
My goal with this album is the same as my goal with every other album that I've ever made in my life as far as Flying Dolphin Records go. It's an opportunity to play the best music I can to the best of my ability with people that I love and people that I respect musically. This is my European group with Christoph Sanger, Rudy Engel, and Heinrich Kerberling. And most of my albums have been with this group because we spend a lot of time in Europe, my wife Patricia and I. And my goal with all of my albums is to play the best music I can, the best that I can, to grow and to do music that is stimulating to me. So that's why I choose the tunes I choose. That's why I write the tunes I write, is to create environments for myself where I can grow and get as good as I can possibly get. So every CD I do them to be better than the one that came before. So every one that I do is better than the next one, and that's how we grow. That's how life goes.
As a Singaporean, could you just say a few words about Jeremy Monteiro? I think just so the people of Singapore know the artist that he is and what your opinion of him is as a musician and as a person.
Well, I think he's a great artist, and I think he's a very, very brilliant man. He's very bright, he's very loving, and he has dedicated his life to bringing jazz music to Singapore, Asia, and the world. And he's a great player, and I think he's doing really, really beautiful, beautiful work. And he puts together great concerts. I've done many, many concerts with with Jeremy, the concerts at the Esplanade, the concerts with orchestra, the concerts with small groups, the concerts with his organ band, and I think he's a great master.
Ernie, I want to end off with a couple of fun questions and name 3 musicians that you absolutely love.
Well, related to my background, John Coltrane, Keith Jarrett.
Maybe we could just spend a little bit on maybe a quick description on why they're important to you. So maybe why is John Coltrane important to you?
Well, because his music set me on my musical path. The energy in his music, the sound of his music was my first inspiration to want to be a musician. His playing was incredible. He was the best saxophone player, physically, the best saxophone player I've ever heard. He played things on the saxophone that were beyond the saxophone. He played something that had never been played before. That's the mark of a great artist. That's the mark of a master. It's someone who creates something that has never been there before in that form. And so that's why I have always listened to, and I still listen to, John Coltrane.
You mentioned Keith Jarrett as a second name. Could you talk about him as well?
Yeah, Keith Jarrett is all melody. Everything he does is a beautiful, beautiful composition. Everything he plays has a beautiful, flowing, melodic form, and I aspire to that. I aspire to creating beautiful melodies, and Keith Jarrett is a master at that.
Now, could you give one more name of a musician you absolutely love?
Yeah, Pat Metheny. For the same reason I love Keith Jarrett, I love Pat Metheny, because his music is so melodic and so touching. You know, and then of course there's everybody. You know, of course there's Duke Ellington. Of course there's Thelonious Monk. Of course there's all of there's Dizzy and Bird. You know, you can't mention our music without mentioning these people. They're all a part of what.
You have worked with pretty much everyone. For you, who are your top arrangers? Give me your favorite arrangers, top 3.
Oh, Oliver Nelson. I really love the way Dave Grusin writes and arranges. And there's a guy in California here that you probably have never heard of that wrote for years for The Tonight Show, Mike Barone. Fantastic arranger.
You played classical music starting out. Who are your favorite classical composers?
Beethoven.
Why Beethoven?
Because he's strongly, strongly melodic. Igor Stravinsky, because he was strongly, strongly rhythmic. And Ravel, because it was just so beautiful.
Well, Ernie Watts, such a pleasure to talk to, like one of the top guys in the world. I mean, it doesn't get better than talking to an Ernie Watts, I can tell you that. It's such a pleasure for me to talk to you, and I'm sure my audience really appreciated all that wisdom and knowledge that you shared. Really, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and I do hope to talk to you again soon.
It was great talking with you.
Oh man, it was wonderful.
And I hope to see you the next time I come to Singapore.
Oh, absolutely. And I saw your last album was Wheel of Time. Do you have another album coming out?
We have another album coming out that's not finished yet, and that'll be out in June. And that's going to be called Home Light.
Where are you going to be playing upcoming tours at? We can just go to your website, but any cool tours you want to mention?
Well, I'm going to Europe in July. I've got things to do at the festival in France and Saint Moritz, and then I'm going to also Spain. I have concerts with Diane Shore, great singer. I work a lot with Diane. We're going to be working in Las Vegas. I have a very special concert on June 1st at the Kennedy Center. That's a tribute to the music of Charlie Hayden. I play with Charlie Hayden.
Yeah, we didn't get a
like
chance to talk about that, but that was a very important part of your career as well.
Right, and I've got a festival that I'm playing in my hometown. Wilmington, Delaware has a Clifford Brown Jazz Festival. I'm going to be playing there. And, it's just a whole lot of different things, working at the Los Angeles Museum of Art. They have a festival series there. I'll be doing a festival there. Working in Austin, Texas. I have a thing at a church that I'm doing in Leimert Park, and it's called part of the Parkside Jazz Theory series. So quite a few things.
Well, you're such a pro, and I think all young musicians can really take inspiration from the fact that you're a working guy, man. I really respect that, and you do it at such a high level. So.
Thank you.
Ernie Watts, one of the greats. One of the greats. Thank you so much, Ernie. Great talking to you.
All right, Nikhil. Great talking with you, too. Bye-bye.